All right, so I want to poke some holes into the idea that there's such a thing as a positive stereotype. And so when it comes to Asian Americans, okay, so Asian Americans, they're portrayed as, quote, the model minority, meaning that if you want to talk about racism and all of that stuff, then how do you explain that racism that happens to, black and brown people? Well, then how do you explain the success of Asian Americans? Well, and the research that was done was talking about was directly connected to Americans in law school. And so what they found out, right, is that Asian Americans in law school, in law, is quadrupled over the past 3 decades. But the first year enrollments in these law schools have actually fallen by more than 40% since 2009. Right. And so then why might this be happening? And so what the researchers are pointing to is that the idea that Asian Americans are not going into law because they don't see their ability to succeed and to be promoted in those spaces as well. And they're tying this to the idea of how Asians are stereotyped in the United States. Because here, right, it's like the model minority idea, the myth of it is to say that all Asians are hardworking, they're responsible, they're logical, they're careful, they're quiet, maybe even submissive. Right? And so those may be very good qualities in order to get into and enter into a field. But when you're talking about litigation, right, in the legal profession, there's this thing called calculated aggression that a lot of prosecutors, that is valued in a lot of the lawyers and the prosecutors and whatnot. And so if your group of people is stereotyped as being passive and submissive and quiet and careful, this idea of calculated aggression might not even be something that people think that you're even capable of, right? And so then what are the effects, right? And so it's not just that there's stereotype exists, but what is the effect? And so what the effect is that Asian Americans that they graduate, that they represent about 10.3% of the graduates from the nation's top law schools, right? And yet they only represent about 3% of the federal judges and about 2% of state judges. Okay, and so I'll be honest with you, if we're talking about that 2%, 3%, and compare that to the demographics of the United States of Asian folks, then that's actually that's about right. But when we compare that to the 10% of the graduates that, the over 10% of the graduates of law schools, well, now we're talking about something very different, right? It's like now that's the number that should be represented in the judiciary rather than their population number, right? And so then anyway, what we're also seeing then with like I said, this idea of connecting the stereotype to actual events and discrimination, right? And even though they sound positive, right, hardworking and whatnot, but what we see is that these stereotypes can also have led to Asians not being in the management positions, that they're the least well represented groups in management and leadership positions. Right? And so then these stereotypes of being quiet and careful and logical, that might actually give them entree into the workforce and get them some really good jobs. I'm going to tell you, I mean, right? It's like, really good jobs and access for Asians in regards to entry level positions and whatnot. But when it starts coming to those leadership positions, that's when their stereotype of this model minority myth, that they're submissive and passive and hardworking and responsible, those are not necessarily the traits of how we would construct a leader in the United States, right? And so then what are some other traumatic things that are happening because of lack of promotion and the stereotypes and all of this, is that what we see is that when it comes to like this lack of success, that Asian Americans, that they have mental health issues that are going largely underreported because, and that they feel higher rates of anxiety. This is what the research says. This is not me saying this. This is the research saying higher rates of anxiety, depression, and panic attacks than the entire legal profession as a total, right? So that for Asian Americans, so let me say that again, that for Asian Americans, that they're experiencing more anxiety, depression, and panic attacks than any other racial group than the rest of the legal profession, right? And so that's how this is going. And so, like I said, I wanted to let you know that if you thought that there was such a thing as a positive stereotype, well, even the positive stereotypes have negative outcomes. And so like, share, subscribe, do all of that. Check me out on BruceHoskins.com if you want to know more about who I am and what I do. Peace, y'all.